I'm Marshal Knox, and I'm here to be interviewed, I imagine, for as being part of the Air Force during World War II.
And more specifically, the Tuskegee.
Tuskegee experience, Tuskegee Airmen, yes.
Yes.
Mainly the Dodo chapter here in Chicago.
All right. Now, how did it all begin for you? Were you drafted into the Army?
I started flying before the Army in what was called the Civilian Pilot Training Program, in which they were training aviators. They knew the war was coming. Someone knew it was coming, and they started drafting and at least giving scholarships for this program. I had 40 hours at the time that I left that program, and I think in 1940, that was 1941 and 42, I took the area test for the Air Force pilot program, and I passed that. But then I was working for Douglas Aircraft, OTU. The airplanes came to us at the end of the line, and we were the people that sold it to the government.
But eventually, the war did come.
Oh yes, it did.
And there was a time for you to go and do some service for your country.
Oh yes, I didn't get in. I got in late because I was working for Douglas Aircraft. I got in '44.
Okay.
They called me up for the cadet program at that time.
How can you describe just family life back in the 1930s and 1940s?
It was a good family life. People got married. I got married too young, I know. But you get married, you started raising a family and raising kids, looking for better jobs, getting them, and moving on with your life.
Okay, you mentioned a normal life, family life.
Well, people didn't get divorced as often and as much as they do now. Right.
But I guess the underlying question would be, what were race relations for you like at
In
that time?
the North, they were sometimes good, sometimes bad. I guess we felt here that we had most of our freedoms, where in the South there was some real race problems. In fact, as a youngster, I delivered the Defender, and I don't think that there was a Friday that I delivered the Defender that there wasn't a hanging or a series of hanging in the South.
Sure.
So I had my own mindset about going to the South. In fact, I could have gone to Tuskegee for a college education, but that inborn fear of the South kept me out of it.
Maybe that might have been validated. It might have been valid.
It probably was.
But so you became a part of the military because they knew the war was coming, and they did have the.
The war had started.
It started.
It started in 40. We
Okay.
went to war at 41.
But what about the Tuskegee experience?
It started at the same time,
Oh, okay.
41. They started the 41. I think beginning of it was right here in Illinois, in Selfridge. No, not Selfridge Field. Forget the name of the field.
Okay.
It started there,
But
and then they moved the whole thing down to Alabama, Tuskegee,
Okay.
Alabama.
But you did become a part of that eventually. Now, how did that process come about?
Well, when they called me up, I went from Chicago to Keesler Field. There you had 2 days of testing. It's called psychomotive, psychological, 8 hours of testing each day. And I passed that test. And waiting to go to my class, and I got a call from home, from the Red Cross,
Yes.
that my wife was having some problems. I left and went home for about a week and came back. After that, I was given another medical examination, and I was told that my left eye wasn't quite up to the standards.
Now, you had received a medical examination prior to
I
going
had
home,
3 prior to that.
and it was just within the course of a week that your eye gave out?
No,
supposedly?
they said that I went to see the colonel to ask him about it, and he told me, "Well, you're not going to fly for this army." That's
Would this be an example of perhaps an underlying racial tone or something?
Well, I would imagine that they must have had enough at that time, enough Afro-American cadets that there was not a problem. Later on, I would return to the Cadet Corps in 1945, late 45, because they needed cadets. I was sent to Fairmont, Nebraska, as crew for the B-20, B-28, the big bomber,
Okay.
B-29s. And I was told there that they didn't have mixed crews, and that
No, a mixed
must
crew
have been a
is
mistake. Black and white. And I would have been the only black member of the crew anyway. So at that time, they retested my eye and found it to be good, and they sent me back to Keesler Field.
okay. And is that where you got your initial training?
I got my initial training at Amarillo, Texas.
Okay.
Yeah,
Now this was after. This is further along in the story.
further along in the story. Yes.
Oh, okay. So let's go. Let's go there. So how did you end up in Amarillo, Texas?
Well, in the Air Force as a mechanic, I had some mechanical training in high school, and we went to Amarillo, Texas, to be further trained.
Now, were African Americans mostly the bulk of the mechanics, or were there?
Well, I think we must have been there must have been about 30 of us down there, and at first when we got down there, all of the class members went to class together. As one unit, one barracks came out, we fell into line and we marched with the rest of the class. We got a new lieutenant, and he was from Texas, and he denied us this right. He told us that we had to wait until all of the other soldiers passed, and then we could get into the end of it. So mostly being from the north, we decided we weren't going to do that. When they all passed, we straggled into class, which was creating a problem for him. But he was a racist, a rabid racist. And he just did not, even when you spoke to this man, he turned red. He looked at you as if you were nothing. So eventually things began to happen on the field, and they got rid of all of us on the field anyhow, closed it down to us.
And you always hear about racial problems and racial experiences, but unless you actually experience that, how will you actually know how it feels? And so, I mean, when this guy came aboard, I mean, how did you guys actually feel? I'm sure you talked about it.
Well, he did some things, and I remember one morning we were all told to our shoes and raincoats and fall out at the front of the street in formation, which we did.
Was this the entire barrack?
The whole entire barracks, the entire group. We weren't that big a group. So we went on. We didn't know. You follow orders in service. And he came through the lines with a white woman. Obviously, she was a prostitute, who claimed that one of the fellows had used her, and whether she said paid her, I don't remember whether she said that he had raped her or something of that sort. But we all began to look at one another, and I broke rank and went back into the barracks. This was an insult to us. There were two sections of people there. There were the people who were the maintenance section, and those of us who were students for aviation students. So we went back into our barracks. We never got along with that commanding officer.
So it was just an insult.
It was an insult.
Now, how were you treated by the officers and the fellow cadets that were not black?
The white cadets, we had no problems with it. In fact, there was an incident going into the airport, going to Keesler itself, where we had to get on a bus that came to the base. And when we got on the bus, we all sat down. We were from Indiana, Illinois, I think, and Ohio. Anyhow, we all got on the bus and sat down together. And we were talking as we usually do in the North. We were talking to each other. The bus driver came through and says, "You fellows have to get up and move." He says, "Can't sit together down here." So we looked at him and nobody moved. And he went under the cowl of his bus and came out with a long gun. He says, "I told you to move. When I tell you to move, you're supposed to move." And we had a big sergeant, white, who was sitting over on the right-hand side of the bus. And he didn't move. He told him, he says, "You know, if you don't put that gun back under where you got it and take this bus on into the field," he says, "I'm going to shove it where you won't miss it at all." So that settled that. But that was our entry into the field itself.
All right, and that was just a sample.
When we
of
got
what was
there,
to come.
we left here, when I left here, it was about 30 degrees Chicago. And when we got there, it was about 90 in the shade, and we were in ODs, we were in woolen uniforms. And we were standing out in formation, and we stood there for about 10 minutes, and the commanding officer never came out. So I decided that before I had sunstroke, I was going to get some shade. So we broke rank and got some shade. He came out and he asked, "Who told you to break formation?" I said to him, "Common sense, sir." I says, "It's hot here. We're in ODs. And we broke rank to keep from having sunstroke." Well, that went over like a ton of bricks. You can imagine that. And from that day on, we just had problems.
But the treatment that you got from the bus driver, and
That was typical.
It was typical, and but you say though that the response that the white sergeant gave, was that typical of how?
He was from the North.
Okay, so that was just a little bit different. from
Well,
what
he
some
was
of
a
them saw.
sergeant, and the attitudes were drastically different between the whites from the South, because the Southerners didn't like the Northerner whites. They were given a lot of problems
The
too
Yankees.
down there. Yeah.
Now, were there some others in your class who were looking to graduate from the training that didn't graduate?
Oh, there were quite a few of them. There was a big washout rate.
Now, were they all white? Were they all black?
No, they were. I'm speaking mainly because blacks and whites didn't train together. The whites went to other Shepherd or some other fields. Blacks, they only had the one field, and that was Tuskegee.
That was a Tuskegee field. But there were some at Tuskegee that didn't make it.
Oh, many, very many. I don't know the numbers, but I think there was 900 or 1,000 who did make it out of a group of about 4,000 or 5,000 that I'm not sure of my figures.
Why didn't they make it?
They were washed out for any reason whatsoever. If you haven't seen the picture Tuskegee Airmen, you should see it. It's explains all of this. And it's very close to reality.
Now, when you completed your basic training, to what unit were you assigned?
When I completed my basic training, I had a hernia. I went through the basic training holding a hernia in because I didn't want them to know that I had anything physically wrong with me. At that point, when I finished, I went to Lincoln, Nebraska, and they operated it and fixed the hernia.
And this all was prior to
Yeah.
Tuskegee.
And then after that, I went to Amarillo, Texas for the mechanics training.
Now, in your basic training, though, was there a morale problem in the unit? Or?
Well, there, you knew, if we were from the South and getting this from the North and getting this kind of treatment, you knew there was a morale problem, a drastic morale problem. For instance, we were on bivouac for 3 days.
Now, what is that?
Bivouac is the basic training outdoors. And we're on bivouac, and we're out for 3 days, where you live as a soldier lives in the field. And coming back, we were short on water. And we saw an artesian well that sprung up out of the ground. So we broke rank to go and get some fresh water, as we had the water that we had taken with us, and it was anything but fresh. We went to get the water, and one of the man who owned the farm, he was living with his sheep and goats, and the animals were drinking the water, and we thought that, that we should be able to get it, fill our flask. Told us, don't come on his property. He had a long shotgun. Says, don't come on his property. We couldn't get water there. So this is the kind of treatment. We were soldiers. We were supposed to be fighting for democracy, freedom of the world. But we couldn't drink water that the animals were drinking. So you ask about a morale problem. I think that that would give anybody a morale problem, more than a morale.
How were you treated by the officers and the cadets in the basic training?
In the basic training, we had, the sergeants were black. The commanding officer was white, so we didn't have much to do with them. An incident happened while I was there. Bilbo, who was one of the senators from Georgia, he came through and he asked why the blacks or the Afro-Americans weren't working. And he told them they were cadets. He says, what difference does that make? And we were assigned to work the garbage trucks because they'd come by and said this. So most of us just refused to do it. I know I ducked out and went down in the back bay and went swimming. And eventually they stopped it because it was more than a morale problem. Things were getting pretty sticky about this time.
What were the repercussions for just refusing to do it?
Well, first of all, I would make roll call. And then when they didn't assign you by name, they said this group takes this garbage wagon, and the next group takes the next. And I just wasn't there. I went under the houses there were built up on so that the snakes couldn't get in them. And I just stayed under the house till they moved out, and then I went on and did whatever I was going to do.
Now, there were blacks in maintenance in World War II, but what kind of aircraft did they fly and maintain?
They maintained the fighters. We only had one group, and that was the fighter group.
Oh.
And later on in the war, they had the bomber group, the 4th, 77th, but it was never completed.
Were there any?
After they dropped the bomb, I was at Minesfield, California when that happened. And we had just completed our B-25 training.
And this bomb that they dropped,